Hello, everyone, and welcome to Integral Live. My name is Corey DeVos. I'm the editor-in-chief of Integral Life, and I am really glad you could all join us. We're in for a real treat this afternoon. We have two of our absolute favorite human beings here today, and they're going to be exploring an integral approach to developmental leadership maturity. And I don't know about you, but looking at the headlines the last few days, I think we could use a little more maturity and a little more development in our leadership. So good timing. First, I want to introduce you to our two presenters. Beena Sharma is the president of the Vertical Development Academy and an international consultant committed to serving leaders and organizations in their growth endeavors. Beena is a lead facilitator of the VEDA Coach Certification Program and consults with organizations interested in implementing vertical development. Hello, Beena.
Hi Corey. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So glad you could join us. And Dr. Suzanne Cook-Greuter is the creator of the MAP instrument and its assessment methodology. Suzanne's an international authority on adult development and is VEDA's strategic advisor and research director. Suzanne's seminal work at Harvard, where she charted new territory in the area of late-stage adult development, is the strong foundation on which VEDA's approach to enabling transformative leadership is established. Hello, Suzanne.
Hello, Corey. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here and share with you some of our approach to thinking about how to support and help leaders in this very complex world.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I'm really looking forward to this. I think this is going to be a phenomenal presentation, and I think our audience is really going to love it too. Before we begin, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So Beena and Suzanne are going to offer their presentation, and that's going to last somewhere probably about an hour or so. And then we're going to open things up to a general Q&A where you guys, our viewers, are going to have the opportunity to share your questions or comments. So if you're watching this right now on the Integral Live page, right underneath the video player, you'll see a link that will bring you to the Zoom app. If you click that link, it's a free download if you don't already have it, and that'll allow you to actually engage with us directly. Once you're in the Zoom app, you have two ways that you can engage with us. You can either submit a written question or comment by clicking the Q&A button and just typing out your message, or you can press the raise my hand button. And what that'll do is that'll let us know that you actually want to be called on, that you want us to turn on your camera and bring you over into the conversation so that you can ask Beena and Suzanne your questions in real time. So, and I'll remind everyone of these instructions again as soon as the presentation's over with. In the meantime, without any further ado, Beena and Suzanne, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, welcome everybody. This is very exciting for us. Integral Life is our community, our tribe, and thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday afternoon. I will begin sharing my screen in just a moment. And Suzanne, if you want to say a word or two of welcome while I set that up.
Yes, this is indeed exciting since we usually address much smaller company, and our approach and our ideas really do seem to be useful to many people. It's a map, and we call the test a map as well for that reason, that gives you quite granular insight into what's next for you, where you are, what might be before you that needs cleaning up, that we say in the integral scene, but also what needs integration. It's a word we actually prefer in terms of cleaning up, because some things don't need clean up, they need integrating and access to it. You don't want to lose it. So Beena, are you ready?
Yes, thank you. So one of the ideas for this presentation is to share a little bit about our work and our framework, and also to talk a little bit about the program that we teach in case you're interested in having a deep dive into this work. It is exciting for us to be with Integral Life because we feel that many of you already are oriented to vertical development, so you already have a good idea. And so it would be great to go a little bit more into detail and get more granular, if you will. There might also be other individuals on the call that are interested in the basics. So we are going to have a broad sweep. We're going to do a little bit of basics. We're going to do a little bit of diving, and then a little bit of information about the program. So we like it to be interactive. If there's a burning question that you have in between, feel free to raise your hand and Corey will help us manage the interaction. We have a little exercise in between to make it a little interesting, so it's not just a lot of talking on this side. So let's get started. The way we imagine this conversation will flow is we will talk a bit about our work and the framework. That may take us about 45 minutes. And then we'll talk a little bit about the program and about your workshop experience. If you did decide to come in and share this experience with us and have a deep immersion into adult development, then what would that be like? We'd like to share a little bit about that with you. And then a little bit about Veda, Vertical Development Academy, what we do. And again, happy to answer questions that you may have about us. And then we'll end with a Q&A. So that's the overall flow, pretty simple. So to get started, our work and framework. So as you know, our work and focus is on vertical development. For those who are not very familiar, all of development can be seen to occur in two fundamental ways. Or you might say there are two types of development or two dimensions of development. One is horizontal development and the other is vertical development. And vertical development is fairly new in the era of even management education. Vertical development has been identified as the #1 trend in leadership development over this decade and the next. So it's not a flavor of the month. It's here to stay. It guides us by giving us a glimpse or opening the door to this sacred path of human development that we can all claim as our path. So the focus is on vertical development, and we have a particular framework that we use. Our framework is part of a range of constructive developmental theories. So we will refer to a couple of other theories as to see how they compare to ours and how is ours different and what potential benefit there might be in you exploring this theory with us. We'll talk a little bit about what is this theory based on, which is ego development theory. So Suzanne is one of the authorities on ego development. If I may say so, Suzanne is working on her magnum opus. So I can't wait for Suzanne's writing and book to be available. So we'll go a little bit deeper into the leadership maturity framework with a little exercise so you can get a sense of each stage of development. And then we'll talk a bit about the map. And again, we welcome questions related to how the application of the map occurs in the world and what are we learning about the map and about its impact on individuals as they take the assessment. As Suzanne mentioned, we do feel integration is an important piece, so we don't privilege vertical development. And that's one of the things that is really important to us, is an ethical holding of the model and addressing it with the sensitivity and the respect that it deserves and that individuals deserve no matter what stage of development that they are at. One of the unique things in our work is that we integrate what we call polarity wisdom within the developmental framework. It was always there embedded in the work that Suzanne has been doing. However, we have in the last few years further explicated how these polarities show up. And because there is a really fine tool kit available for us to practically work through polarities, we see that as a high leverage tool that we can use to support vertical development, even if we are not explicitly talking about vertical development, but working with polarities, we see it as a developmental tool. So we'll cover some of these areas as we talk through our framework. So we can start with ego development theory. And if we say this is ego development theory, then the first thing we need to do is define what do we mean by the ego? And I'm going to have you hear this in Suzanne's voice.
So I've been struggling with this concept. As a linguist, I'm of course extremely sensitive to the reality that whatever we name something, we pull it out of the flux of experience and make it a thing. And if you say ego development, so what is the ego? And where I'm now in my thinking is, it really is that function that is the storyteller, that always tries to make sense of things, that always tries to tell a coherent story, no matter how other people who might listen to the story might think this is a crazy person. A person in an insane asylum, for instance, will tell you that under their skin there are thousands of things crawling around. Now we say, oh, that's crazy, that's not true. But for that person, that is the story that explains their experience to them. So that is what the ego does. It tries to explain the experience of life in such a way that that we are the heroes, that we are permanent, that we exist, and that we don't have to be afraid, afraid of death, of not being. It tries to make us be important. And it tries to make us be safe by the stories we tell.
I also want to add that it's you can see it almost like a reflex, like a psychological reflex. And in evolutionary psychology, it has a name. It's called the orientation reflex. So we are oriented to explaining our life encounters. We want to understand why, or we want to understand what and how. When we experience something, if we are not able to explain it, it's extremely disorienting.
And
so
anxiety producing. And what we find is, of course, this is a universal aspect of being a human being, no matter where on the globe or in which culture. And since history, there have always been stories about where we're coming from, why we're here, who we are, all of that. So that it's in incessant work, and it will do it up into the spiritual realm. The ego will try and deserve anything it can to bolster its own greatness and its own security. And so that's a fascinating thing, that we probably explain ego different than others. Ego in many situations is only seen as a narcissistic and overblown, inflated ego. But we don't use the word in that sense. So just want to make that very clear. And
yeah.
I think the main thesis of my book will be about the function of the ego as the inveterate storyteller.
In some ways, you can say that Suzanne's work is the work of rehabilitating the ego, where it doesn't carry the baggage and the connotations of the negative aspects that come from many spiritual traditions, where the ego is defined in a particular way as something that needs to be killed or that needs to be done away with. And so it's important to understand the distinction between how we use the term ego and what the construct means in this framework. I also want to mention that the other developmental frameworks do not have ego as the central construct, and that's one of the differentiators.
And so giving and using Levinger's method of looking at thousands of sentence completions and creating or developing a theory based on those sentences, that's where we have found about 9 levels that we can clearly identify as being sequential, as being, we can characterize what's different and what's new that wasn't there before, which is really a good definition of a stage, that it represents something that was not there, not on the radar before, that couldn't be seen or discussed or noticed. With each new level, new things can be seen and noticed and integrated.
And so for those, sorry.
So that's the levels, that the patterns we have seen, and I've now done myself 10,000 of them, and the pattern remains pretty much stable. I've not found that I can make finer distinctions at the later stages, because then sentence completions tests just are iffy. If we base the theory on what we get, not from somewhere else. And it's eternally fascinating because each little test is a testament to a real human being and tells us enormous amounts about the way that person makes sense or what choices they make. And it's just endearing, it's fascinating, it's different for each person. And so I've not tired of looking at them and talking to people about how they make sense of their lives.
And so for those who are not familiar with Lovinger, she was the original researcher that through applying the sentence completion test and looking through thousands of responses, began to see these patterns. And she saw that a whole group of people said exactly the same thing in response to some questions that were projective questions. So they're open questions that you can say anything, absolutely. And she found that a whole group of people said exactly the same thing. And that revealed that they had a shared belief system or shared mindset about the world. And then she found that there was a whole group of another set of people that said exactly the same thing, but distinctly different from the previous group. And so she began to see the progression of an evolutionary perspective through these different sets of stories from different groups, and created the original ego development framework, where the earlier stages were seen to be more narrow, more static, more black and white approach with less of self-awareness. And the later stages were more dynamic, had broader perspectives, and were able to navigate and express greater complexity. And I do want to highlight that Lovinger's work stopped at a certain level that she called at the integrated level. And all the responses that fell at the integrated level or beyond were in one bucket, if you will. And she could not find any further distinctions in that highest stage that was, let's say, up until 30 years ago. And this is where Suzanne's work has been seminal, where Suzanne began, based on new responses, began to see that there were distinctions that she could see in that last stage. And I think this is an interesting fact for everybody to hear, that when Suzanne brought this up with Lovinger, saying that she could actually define further stages within that last stage, Lovinger basically told Suzanne, "You're crazy. You know, it's not something that you can see through the sentence completion test. It's just not possible." And Suzanne then went ahead and did 15 years of research, including a dissertation at Harvard, to prove the later stages of development. So it's just, we have the privilege of having Suzanne with us. So it's just something that I invite all of you, that if you have an opportunity to learn and engage with Suzanne, then you should absolutely take it.
Thank you. And so I'm saying one more thing. I guess people see the slides, Corey, do they? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the distinction between phases and stages. Stage theories in generally were made and are invented by people in the middle of their lives. And they're usually going upward and present later stages as sort of a goal. But we don't yet have a lifetime developmental theory which also takes into account the ways we can actually regress in some ways because of old age, because of diminished faculties, both physical and mental. And I think because I'm a bit older, that is becoming something of a concern to me. I would like to think we spend more time in that newer and later phases that before, when the phasic theories existed, didn't even enter the discussion. Now we have, you know, the third age and the fourth age. We have new ages that are not usually included in these developmental theories. It's almost exclusively focused on the middle part of our lives, the 40 or 45 years in the middle. Just to point that out.
The other thing I want to mention about Lovinger is that Lovinger was a researcher and a theorist, and she never intended this work to be used for anything other than research. She actually forbade the use of this work outside research. And so I think that is extraordinary that today we have access to this work and it is being used in service of our own understanding of ourselves. And as it's available as a mirror and as a vehicle for us to understand the journeys of human beings that we live with, that we support, and that we work with. And it is such an orienting, relieving, and revealing framework. So when we work with a lot of coaches and individuals in and outside organizations, and consistently we hear the relief and I would say the comfort of understanding where one fits into this pathway, and a way of understanding and explaining perhaps one's either comfort or one's disorientation in terms of this path, and to have a sense of what's coming next, to have a sense of what's gone by, and to have a sense of why I'm feeling what I'm feeling, and what am I trying to hold on to, and what can I let go of. All of these are very powerful things that can support us in our journey and help development. And I think we have the privilege and the gift now of using this in that way, which Lavenger never intended. It always cracks me up to think about that she never wanted to use it for development. And I think this is the most fascinating thing. I love the research. I love the good theory. The most important thing for me is that I can actually bring it forth, and it helps me become more aware, and it helps me raise awareness. So I love that. Okay. One of the metaphors we use is the ladder climber view metaphor, for which we have to thank Ken. It's such a great and easy way of explaining this framework. And we've added a component to that. So the metaphor works this way. The ladder is the structure. The rungs of the ladder are the various stages that human beings climb through as they grow and develop in their adult life. The climber is the ego, the one that is making meaning, the one that is trying to understand, the sense maker. And the view is distinct from each rung of the ladder. It's the view is what you see, the worldview. And each rung is distinctly different, almost unrecognizable, you might say, which is why individuals who are 2 stages apart find it really hard to understand the other person sometimes, because they don't understand what that worldview is like, because it's so different, especially if they haven't yet accessed that worldview. So in addition to the ladder, climber, and view, we focus on the climbing, this process of development. How do we actually move from one stage to the other? And what do we notice about these movements? Can they be characterized? Can they help us see what is going on so that we can better support the people that we work with? So one of the distinctive aspects of our framework is that we've defined a range of developmental movements that we use to tailor the coaching that we do. So we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Anything more about this, Suzanne, that you'd like to add?
No, I think we should move on.
Okay. So this is our framework, the Leadership Maturity Framework. Many of you may be familiar with Robert Keegans Framework, which has 5 levels. We have 9 levels, and here we have shown 8 because the first one, you don't normally see individuals, functional individuals in society at that stage of development. So I'm going to have you, Suzanne, walk us through briefly just the stages and anything else you'd like to point out from this graphic.
Well, the first thing you probably notice is that we use the rainbow colors, and it has nothing to do, the colors have nothing to do with other colors in other systems, both Ken's and spiral dynamics. We just think the rainbow is the one that most reflects the increasing finer and finer vibrations, if you will. You see there is 2 halves of this thing, the one that's increasing independence and knowledge, and the other half, and they look the same. But when you notice the percentages, you see how uneven they're actually distributed. There is most people, and in most situations, we have about 75 to 80% of the population basically situated in the first half, in the pre-conventional view, and then conventional, a lot of them. So that's really where the work is. And that's something I appreciate Keegan for, that he focuses on that, and that we experience that too. And then there are the post-conventional, which is of course the territory and the delightful playing field that integral folks really, really want to explore. And we have 3 stages in the conventional, which is different from others. And maybe I want to say, well, maybe we get that on another slide, but here you see the beginning. When you're born, you're completely undifferentiated. You can't tell the difference between yourself and your mama's bosom and milk. There's all one unity, but it's an unconscious unity. And then when you go through the whole process of more and more differentiation till the self-determining stage 4, more and more clear boundaries between this and that, between myself and not myself. And the next phase is a slow and regular deconstruction of that sense of separateness, from initially just being able to kind of realize the culture that we are all programmed in a particular culture and language, to the late, very late integration at the unity stage where the separation is really gone. And I feel again unity, but this time a conscious one. So that's an overall sketch of the whole trajectory.
Thank you. You'll also notice that the names here are a little bit different that some of you may be familiar with. So these, it took us many years to decide to rename the stages to better reflect the core aspect of the stage, as well as to prevent a labeling. The earlier names that were more common were expert, achiever, etc. And it was very easy to label somebody as an expert or as an achiever, and that was not serving the person or the model. So it took us some time, and so you'll notice that the new names are really pointing to what is the defining aspect of that stage, and what is the identity at that stage like. And we have further descriptions, phrases that go with each stage, and then more detailed descriptions at each stage also that we work with when we are in, when we teach the material. So in order for you to get a little bit of a more concrete understanding of these stages, because that's the core to, it's really important to understand what each stage is like and the differences between each stage for us to get the most benefit of the model. So here's a quick exercise for you to reflect on, and then this is the interactive piece, Corey. So as people respond, you can help us. So what you see here is a description of how individuals at 7 different levels perceive feedback or respond to feedback or criticism. So each row in this table describes a particular stage of development and how that people at that stage respond to feedback. So what we want you to do is take a few minutes to think through this and rank order which is the earliest stage, and then which is the next and which is the next. So rank order from low to high. So you just do this visually and verbally, and just for you to get a sense of it. Yeah, so just take a couple of minutes, and we can start with, in a minute, I'll ask you which is the earliest stage response. And then we'll have some responses, and why would you say that? And then what's the next stage response? And through that, you'll get one aspect of this evolving response to feedback as somebody develops. So take maybe a minute or so. If you have a piece of paper, you can start ranking it. Just put the numbers next to A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You can put in the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
And again, we're trying to make this webinar as interactive as possible. So again, raise your hand once you've done the exercise and you want to share what you came up with Beena and Suzanne.
And you can actually do this with almost any concept. You can look at how it is understood at different levels, from integrity to relationship to others, to time, how you see causality. All of these can be actually ordered in that way and described, and what it would be like for a person at a particular level, how they would understand that particular concept.
And we do have a hand raised whenever you ladies are ready for
Okay,
it.
we're ready. And there, so even though the model is 9 levels, we've only picked 7. So you don't have the,
Yeah.
you don't have the very earliest and the very latest, but you have the 7 middle. Yes. So which is the earliest stage response? Who'd like to go?
So we're bringing Catherine on over.
Hi, Catherine.
Just 1 second. And let's unmute her. Hello, Catherine.
Are you there?
Yes, I can see you, Catherine.
Yeah, we can see you. Hi, Catherine. Catherine, you are unmuted right now.
Is this me you're talking to?
This is you.
Yes. All right, I just must have hit my hand by accident. I have been doing it. Okay, I only got as far as G. It looked to me like the first level.
Okay, is
And
there anybody else? Well, thank you, Catherine. Sorry
Yeah, thank you,
about
Catherine. Sorry about the confusion.
I'm sorry, but I wasn't doing it, and I must have been moving my hands around. So I was just getting ready to kind of, get it in my mind. So thank you. I'm sorry to be so confused.
That's okay. Let's take a couple more people and then we can move on to showing you the progression. Is there anybody else that wants to take a go?
Yeah, we've got Laura. So let me bring Laura on over and unmute. Hello, Laura.
Hi, I had C as the earliest.
That is correct. That is correct. So at the very first stage, at the very earliest stage, which is the self-centric stage, feedback is seen as an attack because you're protective. And the tendency is to retaliate and not to take on board that there's anything wrong with you because you're only interested in having your own needs being met. So that is correct. Do you have a second one after that, Laura?
Did. Then I had E, or viewing it as a disapproval or sort of what somebody else might think of me.
Yes, yes, absolutely right. At the next stage, at the socialized stage or the group-centric stage, we are more interested in becoming part of a group, and our main intent is to be included, get approval, and so we don't want to be embarrassed or feel any shame about being shown up, and so we want to cover it up. Yes, thank you.
Then
maybe we can just use you as a representative participant and just go ahead and give us a couple more, and then we can.
Okay.
Maybe we have Laura do the first half and Alexandra can do the second half.
Okay, great. What's next?
The G, taking it personally.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, that's the next stage where once you are in the group-centric stage, at the next stage, you begin to have a sense of a separate self. In fact, in this framework, we say that that is the birth of the psychological self. At the group-centric stage, we actually don't have a sense of a separate self because we are identified by who we are part of. So here we've actually separated ourselves and we have a position. And so if somebody criticizes us, then we want to defend that position. Now we have a view that we can defend, and that has been a hard-won view. So we want to fight, and we believe that we know what's what. So that would be the next stage.
Right.
All right. Should we go to Alexandra?
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. Move her back to attendee and bring on Alexandra. Remote to panelist. Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. So after F, that's where we stopped, right?
Yes. I think so.
No, we stopped not at F. We actually we stopped at G.
At G. Okay. So after G, I have F.
You have F. Okay. And why do you think that's next?
Well, just comparing to the other ones.
Okay.
It could be also, I mean, I also thought about A.
Yeah, so let's look at both A and F together. So if you look at F, it says that at this stage, you welcome feedback as necessary to uncover a hidden aspect of your own behavior, and you acknowledge your conditioning, and you're interested in other perspectives. If you look at A, you welcome feedback, especially if it helps you to achieve your goals and to improve. And you're committed to change your behavior, and you believe that you can control your behavior. So there's a little difference between these two in that one is external oriented. You're interested in goals and changing behavior, whereas F is more internally oriented, more looking at what's hidden inside and one's own patterns of conditioning. So that F would be the later stage. The first stage is before that would be A. And then you turn to the interiority. So that you can see that as a fundamental movement from earlier to later stages is you go from an external orientation to including a much bigger internal orientation as you go up the stages.
Good. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
And after F, then I would have D.
That is correct. Yes.
And finally B.
Very good. Thanks, Alexandra. So after, when you are at F stage, you're aware of your own conditioning and you're interested in other people's perspectives. When you move to D, you don't just welcome perspectives, but you actually invite it. You seek it because you recognize that that is the one way we can see parts of ourselves that are not known to us. And there's a greater interest in one's own shadow. And so that would be the next stage. And if you give me feedback that I don't like, that is not necessarily seen as a problem for me, or it doesn't necessarily mean that it has everything is to do with me. It probably has something to do with you as well. And so you're able to take a system view, and you can see different pieces that contribute to the leading up to whatever the feedback is. And at the last stage, but I find this really interesting that feedback is seen as a natural part of a living process. And one doesn't see it as fundamentally different from praise. If you praise me and say great things about me, or you criticize me and say you don't like some things about me, they're fundamentally not seen as different. So you can imagine what kind of worldview you need to be able to have to see it in perspective, and to have a perspective on both, as well as a perspective on yourself and on the other person. So yes, thank you both of you for helping us go through this. So if I move the slides now, you can see it in progression. I'm going to just leave it for 10 seconds and have you move from the bottom to the top. So you just begin to see how we unfold in our approach to receiving feedback. And we pick feedback as one of the core pieces because this is one of the most difficult things for individuals and leaders to do, is to receive feedback. And it's one of the biggest indicators of ego stage, is how do you take something that comes at you as something that might be a criticism.
And being aware of these differences of how people receive what you're doing with them, if you're a leader or a manager, also helps you then in turn tailor your response so that the person does not experience it necessarily the way here we have described it, but that it can be helpful.
Thank you. So thank you for playing with us on this. We wanted to do this so that the stages became a little more concrete using a particular example. Otherwise it can be abstract and a little bit difficult to get your head around.
Yeah, it's a helpful exercise, and it's helpful to actually see how each stage sort of, again, transcends and includes what comes prior. Actually getting that sort of natural progression is really cool. Before we move on, Beena and Suzanne, poor Paul has had his hand raised for like 10 minutes now.
Oh, sure.
Before we started the exercise.
Yes, yes.
I'm thinking maybe we should call on him and see what he's got to say.
Absolutely.
All right. Paul, I'm bringing you over. And let me unmute you.
Hand up. Okay.
Hello, Paul.
Hi,
Very
Paul.
good. Thank you.
Paul.
I had put my hand up before we were asked for this ranking, because I noticed that in what I'd read about Suzanne's work there, and I think you might even mentioned it in one sentence today, there were 9 stages on this ladder, and yet you're using 6 numbers. And I wanted to make sure, do I have on that slide with the 6 numbers where 3 and 4 are different from 3 or 4, and, or in between, that both things you're comfortable with, 9 and 6 for various reasons, yeah?
Suzanne,
We
do you want
have
to take-
basically 9 stages, of which the first and the last are relatively rare. The first is for individuals who are really in some ways not able to be full adults. They're usually in protected environments. They're never in a, or very rarely in a working environment. So we just leave it out. But as a theory, it has that stage defined.
No, Suzanne, his question is about the numbering. So the numbering,
Yeah, this
the stage
particular
6.
slide.
No, the numbering, he's talking about the stage 6. We stop
Oh.
at 6. So that you have 2/3 is a stage, and then 3, then 3/4. So this is a numbering protocol that was created by Lovinger. And because we built on her work, we didn't change them to sequentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They actually start with, there are those half numbers in between. There's 2, 2/3, then 3, 3/4, 4, 4/5. So I'm going to advance the slides and you'll see the numbering system. So you have 8 stages here. And the previous to 2/3 is stage 2, which is not featured on this because, as Suzanne explained, those are not functional. Individuals at that stage are not functional in society. So they're not just
Usually, yes.
Okay, that's
Yeah?
clear. Thank you.
Cool.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. All right. So to continue, we want to talk a bit about how a few elements of our framework compares with a few other frameworks that those of you in the integral community are familiar with. So if you look at, so Suzanne, you didn't talk about the arc going down, right? Not yet?
Not yet.
No, you didn't. Okay, so maybe I should mention that first. Would you like to mention that, Suzanne?
No, because that's one of your babies.
Okay. Okay, so I guess it's something also I can ask, and if anybody has a quick hand up, you're welcome to take a pass. So you can see that this is an arc that goes up, it reaches its height in the middle, and then it goes down. And this line that goes up and goes down is the line that represents the line of the ego that is developing. That is the core of the framework. So the question to you is, why is this line going up and then going down? What does that indicate? What might that mean? If anybody in the next 5 seconds has a thought, you can put your hand up.
Oh, we got one. Paul again.
Hi. My guess is that because you're describing 4, 5 through 6 as times when the ego is less in control of the entire being who's doing the expression. If held in a larger awareness, that's part of the maturity. And definitely in the unitive stage, the ego, I think, is often auxiliary rather than in the driver's seat. Yes?
Yeah, so the first stage where it's no longer necessarily in the driver's seat, but it's still there.
Yes.
You can still be appreciated for what it's doing for us. Yes.
Okay.
Awesome.
So that's partially true. Thank you, Paul. Since this is the line, I'm sorry?
We have another hand. Oh, nope, they took their hand back down. Okay, go on.
Okay. So since this is the line that represents the ego, up until stage 4, up until the middle line, the task of the ego is to build its identity. It is constructing its identity and becoming more clear about who it is or what it is. But once you cross the midpoint, there is a questioning of what has been constructed so far for the first time. That's why it's also called the self-questioning stage. What the individual does is begin to ask, who am I really? And you begin to see the conditioning, you begin to see the forces that have formed you, and you begin to deconstruct. So the line going down is the deconstructing of the ego, a systematic deconstruction of the ego, until there is an awareness that even the ego itself is a construct. So that is what is represented by this arc going down. And
I particularly love this visualization, Beena, because to me it's a reminder. You know, Ken often says, for example, integral is an elitism, but it's an elitism to which everyone is invited. But the way I think people often hold on to that elitism is sort of this, you know, almost to the degree of being disassociated from all of the development that happened prior. There's almost like this exclusive sort of, you know, sitting on top of the world, looking down from 50,000 feet and not wanting to get kind of soiled with what's going on, you know, below you. Whereas integral really is, there's a return. There's a, you know, you actually start engaging the world a bit more. You actually start expanding your identity to the point where it's more inclusive of the environments that you find yourself in, and actually finds itself, you know, more strategic sort of capacities start coming online in order to, you know, be that systems physician and sort of working within the world rather than sort of outside of the world.
Absolutely.
That's why the title that most people know, the paper, 9 levels of increasing embrace. That embrace really means both in time and people and global. More and more is included because there are fewer and fewer boundaries.
And that high point at the middle point, like you said, that is the highest, that is the point where you are the most independent, where you are sovereign and you are separate, the highest point of separation between the individual ego and everything else. And that begins to break down, and slowly you begin to integrate more and more until when you reach unitive, there are no boundaries, or at least you have the capacity to experience no boundary, which is why it's called the unitive stage. So a systematic breaking down of the separations that we have necessarily had to set up in order to even find who we are. And so that's the other thing, is that it is so critical that we get to that stage 4, that we've built something before we can even question it. And that's another implication. If you try and do post-conventional ego development for somebody who's not yet at self-authoring, it's actually a setup. It's not something that will serve them, because they are not yet at a place where they can begin to question who they are, because they haven't fully developed who they are yet.
And we have a hand raised, and we'll call on Arland in just a moment, but quickly, do you notice, it feels like that transition from self-determining to self-questioning is a really big transition. I mean, you're going from moving up that arc to coming back down.
Yes, it's a milestone.
Do you experience a resistance point there for people generally?
It's a big milestone, we should say, and that it can be very disorienting, and it can take a while because society doesn't support the self-questioning as much as it does support. So that's when the environment also begins to play a part. But Suzanne, you were going to say something.
Only that we have a slide about that later. That's coming up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's bring Arland on to ask a question. Come on over, Arland.
There. Okay, let's see though.
Hello, Arland.
Yeah. Hey.
Hi.
My question was about. So we're talking about this peak of the individual exterior and exterior collective. With that peak, why is that peak there? Well, you know, we're bridging between, you know, the thinking and the ethical world. This place of internal understanding and trying to build equanimity there while we merge into the ethical where we would be questioning, reaching out, building this collective. My question is, how, what, why do maybe Beena, you experience the individual, this interior individual, and so that we can get a framework for this leadership maturity that we're talking about.
I'm not sure I understood your question, though. Corey, is there a way you can frame that for me?
Geez, I'm not sure if I could. And Arland, I just want to make sure that we're clear that in these visuals that Suzanne and Beena are showing us, that it's not actually a quadrant map at all.
Okay, so I guess, you know, what I'm talking about here is more the walk the walk of it. And Susan, I guess it could be open to Susan as well. Susan or Beena, either could answer.
Could you repeat your question, Arlen, maybe in a sentence, because I'm not sure I got what your question is.
Sure. So my question is, how, why, or what do you to experience that would give us, the listener, some sense of your individual interiors, so that we can have a framework of, you know, but that's the question. I mean, what I do with it, or what we do with it.
Without going into some kind of lecture and making the distinction, we actually have two different ways of being at this level. The one that most of you are probably familiar with as green, which is it's exteriorly oriented, which is embracing others, but there is also the possibility of growing from stage 4 to 4, 5, and becoming really self-investigating and not being very much into how do I embrace everybody else. Yes, everybody else can have their own perspectives. They all have been programmed like I have, but I'm not that interested in that. I'm really, really interested in what's going on for me. And that is often a way we encounter people, that's where they're at this self-questioning level. Really, really curious of how they can make sense of things now that they realize they have been conditioned before in a particular language, in a particular culture, a particular environment with its own, you know, specific values that we just imbibe. We can't help not to. And that's why we think this is a major threshold from one part to the next, just as big as the one that Integral has between self-questioning and self-actualizing, or first and second tier.
So let's go there. And Arlen, if there's still part of your question that's not answered, we can come back towards the end when we have the Q&A. Thank you for your question. So I was talking about the trajectory, about the arc going down. And so this I want to highlight is the departure from Lovinger's theory making. So if you looked at Lovinger's trajectory, her idea was that the ego continues to build its identity through all the stages. So if we were to represent Lovinger's trajectory, it would look like that. Her theory making involved the identity of continuing to be built past stage 4 or past the self-determining stage. Whereas Suzanne's work really is the work that explicated this deconstructing aspect of the ego. And so the Cook-Greuter trajectory goes this way. And I think this is an important theoretical construct, and to understand also how this is different, and that this is a later stage understanding of the ego development framework. And I find that fascinating, that a theory that sees a trajectory as just going up, up, up all the way itself comes from a conventional idea, whereas it's the post-conventional idea of deconstruction itself is being applied to the theory. And so I think that's just another testament to the development of the theory itself. So I wanted to highlight that, especially for our integral community.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And briefly, George C. asks in the Q&A, when you go down the line, is this where you begin to experience existential depression?
Yes. I mean, you can experience it all along. The narcissism and existential depression can be everywhere, but particularly a construct where it becomes a major aspect. And as Ken so beautifully say, it may, I don't know how he says it, it hurts more, but it bothers you less because you have more resources. You have so many more inner resources that yes, you notice and yes, you suffer, but you also have more means to actually handle that.
Yeah, and that happens particularly at the 5-6 stage, because at 4, 5, and 5, there is the deconstruction, but there is a lot of meaning making that one can be anchored to, and a sense of self. But at 5, 6, when there's a realization that I am an invention, I am a complete invention, I don't exist, and then that kind of questioning of one's own identity is really extremely disorienting. So it can cause, yes, it can cause a lot of pain and disorientation. So I'd like to highlight the where the emphasis is on 3 different frameworks. So in the Cook-Greuter framework, the emphasis is on this big shift between the conventional and the post-conventional. And we find that that is also a big need in large systems and in organizations. If you look at Robert Keegan's model, the big emphasis is before self-authoring, between the socialized and the self-authoring stage, which is between the 3, 4, and 4. And in some ways, we also agree, because such a large part of humanity occupies that skill-centric and the group-centric stage, that the real work in the world, in the large populations, does belong to that place between the skill-centric and the self-determining. So that is Keegan's chosen emphasis. In our framework, the emphasis is a little is there, as well as at the conventional post-conventional shift. And if you look at spiral dynamics and integral theory, the emphasis is between tier 1 and tier 2, between green and yellow, because that has been the inflection point that has moved into an integral perspective taking. So it's interesting, I think it's important for us to begin to notice where is the emphasis in each of these 3 different frameworks that we're all familiar with.
There's not just one momentous leap, there's at least 3.
Right, and within our framework, there are actually other milestones. So there's one other milestone between stage 3 and 3, 4, where I mentioned earlier, there's the birth of the psychological self. At the group-centric self, you don't have a separate identity. So that's a big milestone. And then we just talked about the existential crisis at 5, 6, and that's yet another milestone. So there are 5, at least. There are these 5 big points, and they're all significant. And so any move, whether you're early or late, is really something to be cradled and welcomed and affirmed, rather than judged to be less or more.
These days, even a half step forward that I might take feels like a milestone. So
yes. Okay. The other thing between the Cook-Greuter model and the spiral dynamics and integral model is this one stage in between, the gap between stage 3, which is group-centric, and stage 4, that's self-determining. The skill-centric is just not identified as a distinct stage. And we just call it out because this is based on empirical research. And we see that 40 to 50% of the conventional individuals, especially in professional situations, really come from this identity. And for it not to be represented is a miss in some ways, or shall I say that it is, with adding this level and understanding how this level operates, we are able to reach more people, and we are able to tailor the work to the people at that stage as we understand what is important to them. So for example, knowing is very important. You want to know, and you want to be able to understand how to deal with things. And ambiguity is something that is very hard for that level to take. So working with knowing and ambiguity as a polarity is a developmental target for us at that stage of development. If you look at Keegan's model mapped to the leadership maturity framework, you can see that we have these 8 stages that we look at, and Keegan has 5 orders of consciousness. And if you look at how they play out across this arc, his first order is below the self-centric, so which is stage 2, which we don't show. And then you have the self-centric, which is loosely, some people see that as the instrumental. And then the socialized is usually the group-centric, and a little bit of the skill-centric, since the skill-centric can also be conforming. And then the 4th order is the self-authoring stage. And in Keegan's description, there is some of the self-questioning is also included in the self-authoring. And then the last, or the 5th order, is self-transforming. And you can see the span that self-transforming covers without making those categorical differences that the MAP research has shown. So again, I think different individuals work with different frameworks. We know a lot of people who work with Keegan's framework. So I thought this would be interesting for you to see how it kind of maps to the Cook-Greuter. And you can also get a sense of in what kinds of situations would it actually be more useful to have more granular understanding, and in what other situations would it be quite well to use the broader sweep that Keegan's work gives us. There are other distinctions, of course, as well, which we're not going to go into, but this was a high level mapping just for your understanding. Okay, some of you are familiar with Leadership Agility, the book by Joyner, and they also have an assessment. They've used the map as a base. So so this is also just showing, for those of you who are interested, how their stages map. So they have the Expert Achiever Catalyst that map 2-3 of our stages, and then they have the Co-Creator stage, which is kind of somewhere, it includes some characteristics of the self-questioning and some of the self-actualizing. And then they have a 5th stage, which is the Synergist, that includes the rest of the self-actualizing, but does not actually enter the territory of the construct aware. So this is also something that's useful for you to know. If you are using that, then you know how it maps or not to the leadership maturity framework that we use. So I hope that was helpful as a way of comparing. I also want to take just a couple of minutes to see how, again, to make this practical, to see how you can use the ego development lens to understand the evolution of a particular field. So this is it's a quick study. I come from the management training profession. And so when I first understood about stages of development, I started to see how the management training profession has grown through the stages in the way that it offers solutions to training people. So if you look at the first stage was stage 3, which is maybe 4 decades ago. The first phase of management training was you come in, you join a company, and you get the employee handbook. You learn all the rules. You learn all the policies. You have your job certifications, and you do some mandatory training so that you become a fit member of this new organization that you're part of. That was all that was the extent of training in the very early stages. Once that hit its limit, at the next stage, we saw a lot of skill development and competency training. There were competency models, there was quality improvement, which is all about how do we get better, how do we be the best, how can we improve process. And we had quality circles, total quality management, total plant maintenance. All of these are methodologies that really come from that skill-centric idea that we need to improve process and do our job in the best way, because the identity is defined by what we do, and we want to do it well. The next stage was stage 4, which is the self-determining stage, where you began to see the beginning of sensitivity training. You began to see the beginning of even behavioral training. Until then, there was no such thing as behavioral training. So this was maybe 30, 35 years ago. There was a distinction between technical training, functional training, and behavioral training. Then you've all heard about the corporate university. That became a big thing. So how can we change the world? How can we get everybody to learn and everybody to improve their skills and be better leaders? How do we get a return on investment? How do we management by objectives, learning outcomes, ROI, planning careers? All of these come from that stage 4 worldview. And then about 20 years ago, we began to see the advent of more the self-questioning stage and the multiple perspectives, the 360-degree feedback. Let's hear from 6 people around me and how they see me. The whole idea of action learning became important, learning over time, deep coaching, one-on-one coaching, combining one-on-one coaching with self-directed learning, client-centered, leader-centered training, personal growth labs. You may be familiar with Tavistock and NTL laboratories coming into corporations, group relations. All of these are now going into the interiority and really looking at what is your role, what's your identity, and self-awareness and self-reflection became a big thing. So this continues to be on the edge in many organizations where you do more action learning, you work in action learning sets on real-time projects. And then the last stage, which you see now in some of the organizations, is what we might call an integral stage of learning, where they're integrated interventions, where when you're doing leadership development, you realize you're building culture. You do a strategy workshop with a strategic consulting firm, you realize you're developing leaders. You do leadership development and you realize you're doing change management. So you begin to see how everything is a contribution to the overall development of the system. And there are methodologies like real-time strategic change, large-scale interactive process, LSIP. These are all methodologies that help systemic change and look at the whole system, not just training different groups of people or on different competencies and different sets. So I just shared that with you again as something interesting to notice how a field has evolved and how you can see the worldviews show up in the solutions that they come up with. So I hope you found that interesting. So developmental moves, I'm going to have Suzanne cover this. I talked earlier about the climbing, the ladder, the climber, the view, and the climbing. So we've identified some distinctive moves. So Suzanne, do you want to share?
Yes, we have more moves. These are the major ones. Consolidating, we mean if somebody just enters a new level of understanding, they really need to spend considerable time to expand within. That would be usually horizontal development, to expand within that stage. Then we have the one possibility that somebody sort of step-by-step transitions from one level to the other. And the issues and the things people grapple with are different for these different steps or moves. Then there is the rarer transformation, where you suddenly, in usually quite a short time, switch from one way of seeing the world to a new one. That has its own issues and difficulties and joys and, you know, the excitement of that, but it also has its problems. So we deal differently when we coach with these different things. And then the one I already mentioned, that integration, being able to access all the positive energies of all the levels, is actually necessary for optimal functioning. Because if you deal with a person at the very early stage, your integral or green or loving presence will not quite work. You have to be able to step down and be more authoritative and not feel bad about yourself or in conflict with yourself. If you're integrated, that's just part of your repertoire that you can tailor to different clients and different people you're with or live with, and always with the deep appreciation of how far they have already come. When you think from babyhood to now as an adult, amazing. So the attitude is an important part of what we also try to communicate and teach the coaches that work with us, to have that attitude. There was one question here on the chat that says, how can we achieve, I cannot read, it's tiny, exactly what psychotherapy is needed to achieve unity? And the only response I had, the question about achieving. I think psychotherapy usually, at least in my distinction, is a healing profession, trying to help people become more at home. That would be the consult where they already are, to help them understand some of the things that have been difficult. But such a word like achieving to us is already a signal of the person asking the questions where they might be coming from. Is there something to achieve? What? You know, what's the goal? What's the good? And even more so when you work with somebody else, is your own need or hope for yourself then being transferred on the client, that you have an expectation of them to grow and satisfy your need and your result. You want to see a result when you work with somebody for a year.
So one of the things we
that
say,
is the tricky,
yeah,
subtle things where also the ways of coaching schools differ, what they emphasize, just differences. And for us, it's important to think of integration always in the forefront. Where are you at home? How can we help you to be at home where you are? And then naturally, if you are actually at home, then energies are free to move. And moving, as we say, is a birthright. But it needs the right conditions.
and just in connection to that question, we really look at developmental stages as outcomes, not as goals. So that's a shift. So it's an outcome of the process, the difficult process of navigating life and growing. But it can't be achieved as a goal because you can't guarantee it. But you can recognize the markers as outcomes, and therefore it's a pathway. Therefore, it's a reference point that can actually guide us. And about integration, I also wanted to add that often going back and integrating a part of ourselves that we may have left behind from an earlier stage where our foot might be nailed to the floor is actually a greater service in our vertical development. So if rather than trying to get to the next stage and trying to find what is next for me, but to go back and fill in the places that we haven't been yet, that we've rejected, or that we are still over-identified with, because it's a messy process. Nobody accesses all aspects of each stage before moving to the next. It's an approximation, and different people have different paths through the different stages. And so when we go back and do the real work of integrating, it actually frees up our developmental energy to access the next stage. And then that becomes an outcome. So we focus far more on integration than we do on trying to get people to the next stage of development, which we feel is actually an outcome of doing the developmental work.
Beena, I'm a bit aware of the time.
Yeah, we are almost to the last, I would say last 10 minutes we'll complete, and then we can do open Q&A.
Yes.
So do you want us to pause here, or
Corey? Yeah, well, we have just, Anne has a question. I'd love to pull her in so that she can ask about what you just presented. And I actually have a small question. You mentioned that those are just 4 of the sort of developmental moves that you're tracking.
Yes.
Is one of them adaptation? I often think about, sometimes it's simply a matter of our environment changes suddenly and drastically and forces us into a new space of adaptation. And sometimes that's enough to give us sort of the kick in the butt that we need to make that transition. Or is that sort of covered by one of those other terms?
Yeah, that's a loose word. It's a broad word that you're using, and it's I can understand it's a commonsensical way of understanding the movement, but that adaptation can take the form of a transition or further consolidation or an actual fallback, which we haven't talked about, or, so there are other moves that we've defined, which is part of the proprietary work that we do in the workshop. So we don't have all of them listed here. But I would say that adaptation would be a broad term that would cover any of the other moves that we specifically identify.
Okay.
And don't forget the wonderful defenses we have, a whole range of beautiful defenses, which are all meant to protect us, again, from some of the surprises that come our way. Sometimes we're not ready to deal with them. And then we have the defenses at our service. And as you know from George Valin's work, there are more immature, more mature defenses.
So it sounds like wherever that transformational drive is coming from, whether it's coming from your own interiors or it's sort of being imposed on you from the exterior world, these moves that you're describing sort of describe the dynamics at play, regardless of what's actually provoking the transformation.
Yes, and it's usually an optimal mix between the interior and the exterior.
Okay.
It's usually a mix between the two,
That's
an interaction between the two.
That's helpful.
So can we hold on to Anne's question towards the end, if that's okay?
Sure. Yeah, Anne, well, keep your hand raised and we'll call on you after the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll just touch a little bit upon on leadership maturity coaching, which is how do we support people based on this framework, based on the MAP, which is the assessment that they take. So this is an invitation to come into our program. So we do a 9-day program. The first is a 4-day, the second is a 5-day. In the first 4, and I'll talk a bit more in the end if we have time. In the first 4 days, you get a deep dive into the theory and the framework that we talked about. And in the last 5 days, you actually get a deep dive into how do you coach somebody at each of these stages. And this is for a broad audience. So you could be somebody that is a therapist or a counselor or a coach or a leader, or just somebody that is in a similar helping profession. So our coaching is tailored coaching, and we tailor to these, at least these broad 5 elements. We spend a day and a half working with guidelines for coaching. So this is just a very short description. So we tailor the coaching to the center of gravity of the client based on the MAP, where they show up. We tailor to the developmental movement, regardless of the center of gravity. They may be in one or more of these other movements that we've just described. Or we tailor it to the trailing edge, where are they falling back? And we tailor it to the growing edge, where are they already showing movement? And then we tailor the coaching for specific polarity integrations, just like I talked about at the skill-centric stage, the polarity of knowing and ambiguity, working with that polarity. So we've identified polarities at each stage that are stage related, and that we use that to tailor the coaching. So that's a very high level sort of heuristic how we do the coaching. So Suzanne will talk a little bit about the MAP assessment and the instrument itself. And so how do we measure maturity?
It's been proven and based on really hundreds of thousands of pieces of data that are the basis. This is a empirically based theory, not a theory that was made and then looking for data to support it, which is really a major difference. And it's been tested over and over and over across the world. And fundamentally, we find that it pans out. Even when there are big differences in the cultural beliefs, the differences happen in the conventional realm, because there is where cultural input is the strongest. If you look at people from very different cultures that are very late stage, you can hardly tell the difference between women and men and whatever cultures they come from, whether it's a collective one or an individualistic one, you can't tell anymore. So that's part of that. It is basically, I always compare it to the verbal Rorschach. It's a semi-projective test. So people respond to items any which way they hear that. If somebody hears the item, a man's job, as being insensitive and old-fashioned and all of that, then they project that on the stem. The stem is just what it is, a few words. And what the person does with it is what we are looking at. What do they see? And what can they not yet even conceive of or see? That's how this works. And then you want to say about the report, Beena?
Yeah, sure. So once you get the report, again, that's what's different about our profile is that it is uniquely tailored to the individual based on their responses, tailored to their stage. The recommendations go beyond most assessments. They're not cookie cutter, you know, they take a lot of expertise. We have certified scorers that do this work. The recommendations usually span 2 to 5 years because they're addressing ego level issues. And so it's something that people can go back to and continue to work on. Yeah, so I think that is one of the differentiators of our work is the profiling itself. We don't know of any other developmental assessment that gives you the kind of profile that the MAP provides.
the detail and tailored to that uniquely to who the person was who wrote the sentences and their concerns and the patterns we see in their sentences and words.
So this comes to our program. So just a little shout out to the program that we will be delivering as every year we'll be delivering this year for the first time. We will be delivering the first part as an online workshop in the US and as an in-person workshop in Hungary. It's called the Developing Leadership Maturity Program. Again, it's for a diverse audience. It creates, helps create a depth understanding of the framework, and it's also a program that is used to certify coaches. So if you are a coach and you want to get certified in being able to debrief the map, then you can come into the workshop and then continue a certification process. But apart from doing this for a particular purpose as a credential, the process itself, we believe, is transformational because it's so rich, where you get a real deep sense of this sacred journey of development that all human beings are on. To briefly describe the program, we have 2 workshops. Like I said, there's intensive 1 and intensive 2. The first one is about the theory and the measurement and applications. And the second one is more about internalizing the stages and then being able to work with each stage. So we do a demo at each stage along with real maps, and then you get to working with your peers and practicing with each other as well. If you want to get certified, then there's a supervision process that you go through, which we will describe when you come into the workshop. But again, that's what makes this work rigorous, is that you need to demonstrate your ability to fine-tune the coaching, as well as to do it in a way that is truly affirming, because this is a highly sensitive instrument and can cause damage if it's not handled appropriately. So you finish with a case study and then you can get certified. So that describes our program briefly. It's a very interactive program. We have many different modalities we use, and you get examples of real work that we're doing in the world. We share case studies, and you always have fantastic participants to learn from and who bring a lot. And I want to say that this is a growing field. We're actually co-creating knowledge as we speak every day. We have a network of certified coaches that are doing this work and learning new things, and then we are working to codify the things that we are learning. So it's a growing field. And like I said, Levinger never wanted to use this in development. So it's fairly, it's edge work that we are very, very excited to be part of, and invite you to both learn and to contribute to the field.
Can I say something in defense of Levinger, please?
Please do.
She did it because she's thoroughly a psychometrician and very aware of the sensitivity of an instrument like that. She just didn't dare to, and didn't have, that was not her focus. And so she said, don't. And I think that's wise counsel, because we find that some people get trained in some contexts doing debriefs who shouldn't be doing debriefs because they are insensitive to the subtleties of it.
Thank you for bringing that, Suzanne. I think that's really important to be cautious. And we do not just indiscriminately sell the map. And we don't advocate that an organization just pick it up and run with it. We have a very cautious approach to implementing it. So we've worked with different organizations. When they come in, we start with one person take the map, the person who's designing the learning. So you have an experience, you have a sense of what it feels like, and then you are going to be in a better position to tell us how this is going to work for your environment. So it's not for everybody, we feel. So we are also very cautious. So I think we've covered some of these things. We have a large database of maps, and we continue to develop the manuals that Suzanne is really the owner and the gatekeeper of the manuals and the assessment methodology. The scoring network, the scorer network that we have is a very well-trained network. We have the largest number of scorers who are certified in this. We are working in different countries in different languages. The map is done in 7 languages. We have global partners. So we are really very invested in institutionalizing the work that Suzanne has built on and created, and to, in some ways, be very watchful ethically about how this work is used and how it's understood and how it can be really in service of people and their development. So I think I've talked a bit about this. I do want to say one thing about our technology platform. So we have invested a fair bit. We no longer email a form for you to fill in. There is a platform that has our database, and you can go in, you get a link, you can take the map, you get a report online, and then you can schedule your call with the coach. And so that is we've done a lot of work in professionalizing this approach. We also do training and consulting within organizations as well as public programs. And I think very importantly, our scorer network, our coach network, and ourselves, I think we really want to live our teaching, and we do see this framework as one of 10,000 ways in the Buddhist sense. It's not the only way. The human being is way bigger. Life is way bigger than the developmental framework, but it's one beautiful glimpse into a part of our journey and our truth. So with that, we've concluded the presentation part, and now we are open and can hang out as long as you would like us to, and we're happy to respond to questions.
Yeah, awesome. Well, first off, what an amazing presentation. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I really hope everyone checks out the program. Here in Integral Land, we're big lovers of intellectual rigor and ethical hygiene and, a deep sort of bottomless wisdom. And when it comes to those three, I cannot recommend, any better two teachers than the two of you. So I hope people really take a close look at what you're offering here. This is something really special.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. And I would like to point out the one we do in Hungary just before the Integral European Conference, because we did it last year and we had 30 people from 10 countries. And it was just a fascinating, beautiful, rich, multicultural environment to look at all of this and experience this together. And as Beena mentioned, the kind of people that are attracted to something like that are in themselves wonderful resources, richly gifted in all kinds of ways, and insights about things that you then participate in the dialogues with them. That makes the experience just really lovely.
It's fantastic. Fantastic. And, the other reason I love this conversation that we've been having for the last hour and a half so much is, integral folks, well, let me reframe that. Again, here in Integral Land, we love to play with, concepts of sort of psychological development, and we love to play with spiritual language. And oftentimes that can create some confusion for people. For example, so much of our, psychological language is about supporting the ego, developing the ego. Growing up is itself the process of an ego, sort of getting bigger and bigger. And I know that throughout my life, my biggest role models were often people with some of the biggest egos I've ever known, Ken included. But they're also the people who've done the work to make their big, beautiful egos a bit more transparent to themselves. And that's where the waking up and the cleaning up, that's where that work really comes to shine. So the goal is to have a great, big, beautiful, transparent ego that actually helps us come online and show up more fully in the world around us in all 4 quadrants. And I love sort of the immediate clarity that this presentation gave to, what's often seen as 2 conflicting drives, which is sort of to develop your ego and then simultaneously to transcend or sidestep or subvert that very same ego. There, there's a way of holding, in fact, Integral sort of demands that we hold these in concert with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So I saw a couple of questions.
Got a bunch.
Sorry, are you okay if I picked a couple and responded, or do you want to curate?
We've got 3 with their hands raised. We've got a couple scattered through the Q&A, so we can do it in whatever order you want.
I'll just take a couple because they are easy. They're right. So if that's okay, Suzanne, I don't know if you can see the question. So Paul's question was, have you found that coaches who come for program cannot be useful if they are at if the clients are at later stages. So Suzanne, you want to take that? That's a common question.
I didn't actually hear it.
That coaches who have clients who are at later stages than themselves, can they actually be helpful?
They can. It depends on what the client actually is looking for. If he's looking to have somebody who can look at their patterns, a mirror, and that can see more of their blind spot, then perhaps not. But if they need some training in some specific area, they're not very good with money, or they're not very good with timekeeping, then a conventional coach could be just the thing they need.
Right. And we do say that if you are wanting to do developmental coaching as an external coach, not inside an organization, then we do require that you are at stage 4, 5 or self-questioning stage at a minimum, because in order to do developmental coaching for
Yes.
post-conventional levels, then you would need to be at that stage minimally. But you can do skills coaching even if you're at a conventional stage. That's not a problem. Somebody asked a question, if I've taken the map in 2008, this is Edward, do I have to take it again? And 2008 is 10 years ago. So generally we say that you can take it once you've taken the map. After 3 years, you can take it again. You don't have to. But if in those 3 years, there's been significant life changes, then you definitely can take it in 3 years, but not less than 3 years. But anywhere from 3 years after, if you want to take it to see how you've moved, then absolutely, by all means, you can take it again. Let me see, and I'll just take this last one, which is Reggie's question. How can a person bring family members into higher stages? Or is it possible while bringing yourself into a higher stage yourself? So Suzanne, go for that.
I've got a 5-year-old, so I'm really interested in this answer.
Okay.
A very sign of your maturity, now we're talking about maturity, not just cognitive complexity, is your capacity to interact with 5-year-olds and people at all levels, and do so in an appreciative way, and truly understanding what it is like to be there and what the difficulties are, and what you, if you really did the journey fully, you know what that is because you've been there. And not to have that expectation that they will change. They will change if you provide a loving, caring, and good environment that also sets boundaries depending on the age and the level of the person. You have to be able to do that.
And how you hold other family members and how you judge their maturity is a function of your own maturity. Certainly. So, I mean, it has taken me years, even after teaching this theory, it's taken me years to realize that I have every time, again, to learn that everybody in my family is completely entitled to be who they are, exactly as they are.
And that's actually not as easy, and it is a sign of deeper compassion and understanding. I see a question here that intrigues me, the one about the lectical assessment.
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
I just took it, the one about the self, and all I can say, this is a very good instrument if you look purely at cognitive complexity and structuring of meaning making, and it is, in my view, a theory about things. It's not a theory because you can argue and reason beautifully and explain beautifully things that you have not integrated, that are not actually part of your embodied self. And it's interesting and it's good, and I think it works especially well for the conventional levels. And it has a very clear intention of helping you move along their scale. So if you test it at one scale, 10.3 or something, then it will tell you how you get to 10.4. And from what we have already said, you probably have a sense that that's not what we are about. So again, depending on what your intention is and what you'd like to learn, it is very well done and very rigorous research behind it.
Fantastic. Well, should we do a couple live questions?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, let's bring Anne on over.
I always like to see who is here.
Yeah, it's always the fun part. Hi, Anne.
Hi. I was really quite taken with your notion of how you did all of your data research with sentence completions and open questions, of course, as we do in coaching. But I have a linguistic background as well as an education background as well as a business background. So when I bring all of three together, when I'm hearing integration, I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the shift in languaging that occurs or that you have noticed at the higher stages. It's something that I've noticed with clients or with colleagues when we get into a higher understanding of ourselves, if you can put it that way. Have you noticed a linguistic shift, not only in vocabulary, but also in sentence structure, also in approach, in all ways, really?
That is really what we teach when we teach the scoring, is both the structural changes, the complexity of the sentences, the capacity to name, differentiate, because that's one of the way we grow. And we can say, instead of just saying sad, which is what the child might say, to have subtle and different words for different states of sadness. That is part of the indicators we look at. But we have about 13 different ones. Vocabulary, subtlety, and structure are just two of the many that we look at. Yes.
So when people begin to express themselves in what I will call here, just for differentiation purposes, a more spiritual language, which has nothing to do with religion, simply has to do with a different stage of personal and also collective awakening. Are you finding that the language then becomes very different?
It sometimes does, and actually from our perspective, it raises some big questions, namely, to what degree does the person now use phrases that are very common in the spiritual literature to express themselves, and quite often they're a little bit disappointed. I'll give you just one example. There's one sentence beginning that says, I am. And you don't know how many people then just put a period. Or they say, I am that. The whole system of ego development scoring is based partially on how common a response is. A common response does not get rated highly. It's conventional because it's a convention in the spiritual realm. And often people are a bit disappointed because they feel they're deep when they say, I am, period, and write a period. But we're looking for unique, we're looking for the embodied way of expressing your spiritual achievement, if you will. And so it's a problematic issue. It's become more problematic as more and more people have access to that language. And I'm writing about that, just how cautious we have to be, not to confuse, again, what people can say about something and what they have internalized and strive for.
Right, that makes sense to me completely, because I've just entered the realm of conscious business, and I'm finding that the language is conventional in my sense of the word, and that the embodiment is a completely different stage.
So yes,
there's so many different stages to integration, period.
Yes.
That I'm sure you're noticing as well. And for people to be able to make any kind of a change, let's say in a cultural collective consciousness way, we need to understand what that means. People use the words. They
Yes.
don't really know how to behave. They're still into the norming, forming, storming, which is almost pre-conventional when you start thinking about it in some ways. So yeah, so I'm really appreciating what you're saying and the depth of your research, so thank you.
Awesome.
And one thing I remind myself often is, and people seem to forget it easily, is in order to let go of something, you have to have it. You can't let go of an immature ego. You can't do the spiritual bypassing, really, which is a lot of, I mean, I understand the yearning for that safe, perfect place one imagines, but you actually have to go through the stages. You have to develop a mature ego before you can transcend and let it go.
I agree. Thank you so much.
Thank
I
you,
really
Anne.
appreciate your research.
There's one question here, Corey, I'd like to take.
Go for it.
This is Reggie's question about, is there a language to each stage? Just by listening to a person, you can tell what stage or stages that person happens to be in. And so I would answer this very cautiously, that yes, at each stage, there are particular words and particular concepts, and the way they are used, it could give you an indication. However, it's very easy to make this a reductionist approach by saying, oh, somebody is very rational, they must be stage 4, or somebody is very pleasing, they must be stage 3. And so we're very cautious about that. And so the language is one clue, and there are 13 big clues that we look at when we try and understand what stage a person is coming from. And even if there's a very categorical expression from a person, which seems like it's from very clearly from a particular stage, that doesn't mean that that person is at that stage. It means that at that point in time, they've expressed a view coming from a certain worldview. But that doesn't mean that that's where their center of gravity is. And that's why we rely on the map, which is a more scientific instrument. And we consistently find people are overestimating themselves or underestimating themselves based on their ideas about where they might be based on their knowledge of the stages. So it's just something that we're extremely cautious about.
That's great. All right, I'm going to bring Jonathan on over.
Okay.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hey,
Hi.
how are you?
Hi.
Good, how are you?
I have a question about the model, and I wanted to acknowledge you, Suzanne. Your and Don Beck's work was instrumental in me going from self-questioning to the actualizing stage, and I really want to thank you for that. That was 4 years ago. That was, I think my family and friends are thankful that I had some model to go by rather than just the disruption of my life. So I want to thank you for that. My question originates from the model itself. I find it interesting, and I was wondering if you could comment on the statistics or the research and why you chose to take the Delta 3 rule-oriented stage and merge it with the 3 stage, and then simultaneously over
You're broken up.
aware and construct aware and merge them together. It occurs as like.
Unfortunately, the crucial things you broke up.
All right, let me try again.
Yeah, try that one more time.
Yeah, okay. In the rule-oriented stage, Delta/3 in your paper versus the 3 stage, you merge those two together. And then in 5-6, you merged construct aware and ego aware together. That was like, I found that interesting that they were both, you know, a mirror image of each other on both stages. And I was curious if you could comment on why in the model or the statistics or the research you chose to push those two together.
There are actually different reasons. The first one is that we have, since we're mostly dealing with true adults, the rule-oriented stage is one of the emerging sense between two, 3, and 3, between being totally self-centered to being group-centered, and it happens mostly in adolescence. And our data is just not focused. I don't have enough evidence. And for dealing with adults and in the workplace, that distinction between opportunist or 2, 3, and 3 is sufficient. It's a practical reason. theoretically, yes, we still retain the idea that that's happening there. And between 5, 6, and 6, I just 5, 6, the two versions of 5, the two versions of 4, 5, the two versions of 5, 6. And I don't know what we can say about the sequence. It seems almost more a personality issue to me, that some people are, again, more interior and more interested in the ego aspects of things, how I make meaning of things. And there are the ones that are more interested in creating and constructing ever greater, ever more meta theories. And it's a fascinating thing to watch that. And then what we're looking at again is, how do you hold your theory? How tightly do you actually think this is a real thing? And how much are you aware it's another story, it's another theory? And it may be very helpful, but it's just that. If you don't have that capacity to take a distance on your own theory, then in my view, you are more likely to also cause some damage or make some claims that can't be made. I don't know the sequence, whether there is a sequence or whether it's two sides of the same thing, two different expressions of the same thing. I would say
like an orienting perspective, like whether
yes,
some is orienting upper left or upper right kind of thing.
Or personality as well. You know, some of us are more inclined one way or the other. I do think it's easier for somebody who is ego aware to actually transcend than for somebody who is attached to the construct aware aspects of things, the rational, the cognitive complexification of things. But that's just an impression, that's just a hunch. I don't have the evidence for it in a real research sense.
I'm speculating here. Is there a way to test, say, stages of consciousness and ask the question whether one part of construct aware and one part of ego aware is the same stage of development, but the state is different?
I don't think, I tend not to think it's state related. The whole ego development theory actually doesn't focus on states.
Right, right.
They're part of the birthright. We can have states from the time we're being born to consciously trying to create state experiences later on. But I don't think it's a state issue. No, I don't. What I really believe is that sentence completion tests are not adequate tools to tap into that kind of understanding and realm. And there are other tests. It's just
What are they?
This is not the place.
Okay.
But there's
plenty
out there that you can look. The one that comes to mind, and now I forget the name, Martin?
Jeffrey Martin, yes.
Yes, he has a very comprehensive view and approach to different ways of tapping into that realm.
Awesome.
I think I'm sold. You'll see me at one of your courses in the future.
One of the things it may also be is my limitations. There are things I can't see that some others probably can see. So don't forget that aspect of the whole thing as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we have 2 more hands raised. I'm aware of the time right now. We probably want to get through these in the next 10 minutes or so.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So let's see, Benjamin and Laura. First, I'm going to bring on Benjamin. And there we go. Hello, Benjamin.
First of all, thanks. That was brilliant and inspiring. My biggest question has to do with kind of the zooming in or zooming out. Because, you know, when I'm looking at that half circle, it almost seems like there could be more complexity with, like, if you zoom in, there's almost a lot more going on. in each of those.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, if we zoom out, maybe that's only one half of, you know, this spiral of development that's continuously in each moment, kind of, not each moment, but, you know, it changes in time, going around this circle. And when you're at the unitive stage, it's not, you know, you're not stuck there. You move around, and you know, depending on the circumstances, can go into that group-centered stage or station rather. So
one thing I would say here is we only showed you one representation. We have actually multiple representations, each one focusing on, we use the spiral as well to show between integration and differentiation, how that works. I use what rarely, but I do have the half circle actually can be a full circle if you call it the cosmic egg. It has evolution and involution as well. And of course you can go different places. You don't just go in one direction. The theory describes it as a invariant sequent in one direction. But life is not that way, and you're not that way. And we can choose from which level we want to operate. And hopefully that is based on the environment and what's needed in the moment.
Yeah, I want to add something to that. In the zooming out, Benjamin, so the arc is in some ways the highest level representation of the movement of the ego. So it's a very broad description. But in terms of the actual dynamic, I see it more as a fractal. And there are recursively, you go through all the stages in different situations. So just for example, and this is interesting because when I was early in the integral community, we would, you know, something that we would observe in groups, that when you enter a new community, you can actually, even though you might enter at the post-conventional stage, you will likely go through the few stages in sequence all over again. You'll start, but you want to be by wanting to be part of the community and conforming and learning to see what is the language here, how do people behave, and trying to fit in and join the group activities in a way that makes you a member. Then as you progress in the community, then you want to be seen as the expert, and then you want to know all the different parts of the theory, and then you want to critique Ken for into page 233, you said this, and in page 686, why did you say that? Even though you're post-conventional, you are at that skill-centric stage of understanding, you're defining yourself by what you know. And then once you get past the stage, then you really want to become an evangelist. You want to change the world. You want to take this into your neighborhood, into your family. I mean, so you want to predict and control the outcomes of an integral approach. And then, you know, and then so on and so forth. So just as an example. So I think that's a fractal recursive way that we inhabit these stages in new situations. And sometimes in the same situations.
Great, thanks. The other question was kind of around which line is this? You know, it's operating in the world, it's the identity. Yeah,
it's the ego line or the self line, we would say, right, Suzanne?
Ken used to say the self system. It's again the storyteller that brings all the lines together, because even if you think of yourself as an example, you're very highly developed cognitively, and you know in your own self, you actually know I'm not emotionally that skilled. That's where my problems are. That's what the ego will have a story about that. It will explain to you why that is. So the ego is really the one that holds and tells a story about all the lines you're possibly aware of.
Wonderful.
It's not a line in itself, if you will.
Okay. And the speech versus the written, that's the other piece that I'm really puzzled about is, you know, we're telling these stories, and it depends on if we resonate them or if we write them in text, you know?
I mean, even now we're telling stories, both you and we do. This can't be helped. because we live in a symbol universe and we couldn't communicate without using language. Yes, there is a slight difference, but the test can, for instance, can be done both verbally and written. If somebody can't write for whatever reason, is bedridden, you can do it verbally with them. Yeah.
Awesome.
Great, thanks.
Benjamin, thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. So let's bring Laura back on. Hello, Laura.
Hi, I'm curious about the differentiation between a stage and a phase. Could you talk a little bit about what the difference is and why it matters?
So the difference between a stage and a phase.
So Suzanne, I don't know if Suzanne heard that question, but Suzanne had responded. So I'll just take it just as a way of, as having a different voice. So the difference between the stage and phases, phasic descriptions have to do with life roles and events. So, and also biological maturity. So a phase would be infant, toddler, young adult, middle age. So those are age related. They could also be role related. They could be, you know, you're a student and then you're a professional and then you're a householder and then you're a grandparent. So, you know, there are different kinds of roles, but they are common and they're shared by humanity, but they don't necessarily, they don't necessarily differentiate in terms of stage of development. So you can be at a particular, you can have 5 people in the same phase of life, but they can be very different in their stage of development. So the stage of development has to do with your perspective taking and how, and what your worldview is and how you make meaning and your sense making, your belief systems.
Okay, so it's not like a 3-4 or a 4-5. It's not the shared number. It's something different.
I didn't understand that.
So I was curious on the model where it'll have like a consolidated number, a whole number, and then there's a partial number. Like
that's a different, that's all within the stages realm. You have the full numbers and the partial numbers. They just mark the stages of differentiation and integration. It stands for something, that every alternate stage, there's something common about it. But that is has nothing to do with a phase. Phase of life is completely different.
Okay, I was mashing those together.
Oh, okay, all right.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I do want 30 seconds, Corey, to clarify something later, but I'll wait for you to give me the cue.
No, please, now's the time to do it.
Oh, okay. So just about the program. So Lily, our colleague, is on the call. Thanks, Lily, for being on the call with us. So I reminded me to clarify that we have the online program we have in April and July, and this is part 1, and the part 2 is always in person. The part 2 will be in August this year. We also have a part 1, which is in person and not online, which is in Hungary. So just wanted to clarify. So what you see on the screen are the 3 options to do part 1. And then we have a part 2 in phase, which is not here on the screen. And then I can send you something that you can put up along with the recording, Corey, in case people are interested. We also got a question about the map assessment, cost, etc. So that we have a brochure that I'll just send you, which you can just post along with the material so people can get some basic information.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. Well, I think I feel happy, whole, and complete. How about you?
Yeah,
yes.
2 hours. That went by fast.
It really did, didn't it? Thank you to all of our viewers. Amazing questions, awesome feedback.
Yes.
We have the best viewers here.
Yes, yes, you do.
We know that. That's why we were so happy to be invited to share.
We're very privileged to be here with you, Corey. Thanks for doing such a great job of anchoring and just bringing everyone together.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to have you both here, and I hope we can do this, you know, more often. You know, when I first started working with Ken 15 years ago, I used to say my goal was to surround myself with people who are smarter than me, more wise than me, and more attractive than me. So thank you both for making that.
You're a charmer.
All right.
Thanks,
and
Corey.
everyone out there, thank you Thank you so much. We'll have this video posted on the Integral Life website probably later tonight. If not, then early tomorrow.
Okay, wonderful.
And we'll get it up there and we'll send it out to everyone. Thank you all. What a fantastic afternoon.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. Great to have you all. Bye for now.
Good night, good morning, good afternoon.
Thank you, Suzanne. Bye.
Bye-bye.